So China clearly accusing the US of dangerous and irresponsible escalation with the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. China wants their ships to pass through the strait unhindered. Now, will this lead to further escalation or perhaps even a clash with the United States? What are options? What happens next? Will we see an expansion of this conflict or an extension of the ceasefire? Joining me on India First is Ambassador Daniel Fried, former US ambassador and distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. Also with me is Professor Reza Khanzadeh, a professor of Middle East, Islam and Politics at the George Mason University. Welcome. Ambassador Fried, your appreciation, sir, China calling US actions of blockade dangerous and irresponsible. China imports close to 1.5 million barrels a day of Iranian crude. Will the US blockade lead to rising tensions, perhaps even a clash between US and China? What happens if a Chinese-bound ship is crossing and the US were to stop it?
Well, the Chinese are poorly placed to lecture the United States on respect for the law of the sea, considering Chinese actions in the South China Sea and its claiming of territorial waters and general aggression against other countries. So they are not on strong ground, claiming the mantle of the rule of law. That said, it seems to me the US is looking for leverage against Iran, seeking some kind of negotiated solution. I don't think the US position is any longer a demand for Iranian surrender, which it's not going to achieve. The latest reports suggest that, ironically enough, the US is seeking some kind of an arrangement with Iran, which could be similar to the Iran nuclear deal, the so-called JCPOA, negotiated during the Obama administration, hopefully better than that deal, but some negotiated settlement. The Iranians have not ruled this out. There are, I believe, plans, or at least discussions of plans for further negotiations. So the US talk of blockade of the Strait of Hormuz needs to be seen in this context. Secondly, the US position is that the Strait of Hormuz should be free for all or closed for all. Now, in practice, this will be more complicated, but that is a defensible position. The US is trying to seek leverage with the ultimate objective of reopening the strait. I don't know what the US
will it get that leverage? Will Iran, let some ships cross? Professor Khanzadeh, 80 to 90% of Iranian crude exports is to China. The blockade is meant to hurt Iran and compel it to open the strait for all. The reported losses to Iran are close to $435 million a day. Will this put pressure on Iran to open the strait?
I don't believe so. We have to take into consideration that this regime, their most important, objective is their own survival. So for them, any type of compromise or any type of sign that shows a willingness to, concede to Trump's demands or to concede to global demands when it comes to the strait, in the psychology of this regime shows it as a sign of weakness, and then it can open up future types of conflicts and also future types of demands from either Washington or Europe or whatever the case may be, to where this regime will see itself in the years to come continuously having to, capitulate and to compromise on certain aspects of its policies that it seems, or that it sees important to its own, to its own existence. So when it comes to the strait, or even when it comes to these, negotiations, while we see positive signs that neither side is saying that they are walking away from the table, so to speak, or we're seeing positive signs that Trump is saying that they want a 20-year moratorium on, Iran's nuclear program, while Iran is saying 5 years. From the Iran perspective, from this regime's perspective, they are just buying themselves time so they can regroup and re-strengthen their, military for the next conflict. Because from this regime's perspective, they're seeing this 2-week ceasefire. They're seeing this, level of negotiations being prolonged and extended as an opportunity for them to just re-strengthen and to reposition themselves for a future conflict. Because like I said, for this regime, there's only one of two options. They either continue to fight until they fall, or they continue to fight until the United States and Israel get tired of fighting and realize that they just need to leave this country alone, and future conflicts is just going to be more devastating for the global economy.
Future conflict, it's not if, but when is your reading, Siddharth. But if Iran is unable to export the oil and it continues to pump, the storage is finite, what happens then? Because beyond a week or two, will there not be consequences, adverse consequences for Iran, Siddharth?
Those adverse consequences are not just playing out for Iran, Gaurav, just a digression. Let's take one example. Spain has just announced a release of 4 days more of crude oil from its strategic reserves, and it has just 8.3 days of reserves left. And this is going to be something that will play out across the rest of the world if this were to worsen. As of now, it's very clear that this is an effective blockade, minus the China exception. But China has been getting exceptions from the United States, even on tariffs, for example, if you recall. So the rest of the world is going to pay a price. Now, to your question on what happens to Iran, flip it around. If Iran is not able to earn cash from its exports, and the most substantial revenue generator for the Iranian economy has been its crude oil exports. If it is not able to earn cash, and many of its global assets, holdings across the world have been frozen, how does it pay for its imports? So even imports will collapse, and that will have second-round consequences for exporting nations. Just for an example, much of their rice comes from, basmati comes from India, just as an example. So the Iranian economy and the downside to it is actually very, very difficult to predict, because there isn't a real-world scenario that I can at least recall in the recent past of such an unprecedented cash stoppage, blockage for an economy of the size of Iran.
So let me bring in Ambassador Fried into this conversation once again. Ambassador, Professor Khanzadeh is clear that it's not if, but when fighting resumes. Is that also your reading, that whether it's within 2 weeks of the ceasefire or maybe a couple of months later, conflict will resume?
I'm not certain that military action will resume. The war is not popular in the United States. I don't know that the United States can actually, using only air power, destroy Iran's military potential. And on some level, Trump may realize this. I think the US and Iran both are searching for leverage. Both realize that some negotiated solution is more likely than not. And in the longer run, don't forget that the wild card here is that the Iranian regime is not popular in Iran. It was only a couple of months ago that we saw massive, sustained demonstrations against the regime that were drowned in blood.
And that was put down so harshly. So give me another 30 seconds, and before I bring in Professor Khanzadeh, Ambassador, what are the options for the United States? Can and will it stop crude bound for China, for example, on the blockade aspect? And do you agree with some analysts who say that America has a bigger game plan, and the game plan is to stop or choke energy supplies to China? First it was Venezuela, now Iran.
I think that some in the Trump administration like the idea of going around the world and crushing U.S. adversaries. They did so successfully in Venezuela, at least successfully, at least so far. We'll see how this plays out. They're finding that not quite possible in Iran. I think that the best solution now for the United States, but also for the world, would be a negotiated solution, some kind of longer-term Cold War situation between the United States and Iran. And don't forget, as I said earlier, that the Iranian regime is not popular in Iran. And if the United States would consider a broader, more patient strategy, I think that would lead to a greater success than the search for a quick military victory.
Would that take 6 months, a year, even longer? There are several reports on that account. But Professor Khanzadeh, what are Iran's options if oil supplies do not resume? Will Iran be cutting its nose to spite its face? Iran suffers, Gulf countries suffer, the region suffers, sir.
Yeah, that is a valid point, and there are a lot of variables that are just unknown at the moment that we need to, keep in consideration. But there's also another angle to this where the positive, I don't like using that word, but the positive of this regime is that there has been, consistency with it, right? We have been forced to live with this regime for over 40 years, as opposed to the United States, where every 4 or 8 years we have a different, president, and then therefore a different type of policy. You compare Obama with Trump. But with this regime, with the Islamic Republic, they've had 40 years to really prepare themselves for this moment. And they knew that this moment was inevitable because they understand that they are not popular domestically or regionally or even internationally. They are considered by most experts as a pariah state. And I agree with everything the ambassador has said, but I would, add a different layer of complexity where from the US perspective, yes, you have, November midterm elections coming up. You have the entire global world putting pressure on Trump because of the economic pressures, but that plays to the advantage of Iran at the negotiating table. So even though, like you said, they have a finite number of space for their oil, Iran has been prepared for this, like I said, for decades. So they have enough money in foreign, banks and assets. They have enough money, saved up to where they can have a plan B and a plan C to avert any type of crisis, domestically. But then also because they are faced with a U.S. administration who has midterm elections, who has all this pressure, Iran feels at the negotiating table they have the upper hand. So they are very unwilling to budge or compromise because they know for them it's just a waiting game. They have to wait it out. The closer they get to November, the more desperate they think Trump is going to be to want to cut a deal. So they're not going to want to capitulate or even to compromise. So that's where I think that tension is going to kind of stir up at a moment to where we might see more conflict.
So that, give me a moment. I'll just come to you. But let me take one question with the Ambassador Fried. Ambassador, Russia has offered to help. Russia has offered to take control of that 450 kilograms of enriched uranium from Iran. Should that be acceptable to the US as a way forward? That offer was made even earlier by President Putin. It's just been reiterated by Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson.
There are some in the Trump administration who might find that interesting. I think that the Russians are motivated by a desire to help the United States in Iran in exchange for the United States turning away from Ukraine and allowing Putin to continue to conquer the nation. I think that's a bad deal. I think that the Russians are facing a possible defeat in Ukraine. I think that the U.S. should be helping Ukraine turn back the Russian war of national extermination. So I would not urge the Trump administration to accept such a Russian offer. I think that there may be a solution with Iran that could take place without the Russians. And again, a long-term sort of Cold War but stable standoff between the US and Iran might be the best we could expect from the current situation. That could be attainable.